The moment my wife smirked at me across that courtroom, she thought she had already won. She had the deed in her hand, my name crossed out, her name printed in bold underneath, and a lawyer beside her who charged more in an hour than I used to make in a week. She leaned back in her chair like a woman who had already spent the money, already picked out the new furniture, already imagined my key not fitting the lock anymore. And me? I just sat there. Quiet. Hands folded on the table. Because I was the only person in that entire room who knew what was about to happen next. But to understand how a man ends up sitting calm and silent while his wife tries to steal the roof over his head, you have to go back. You have to see the good years first, because the good years are the trap. 6 months before that morning, I would have told you I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one. Nobody has a perfect one. But a good one. I would have told you that Rachel and I had our routines. Our little jokes. The way she stole the blanket every single night and blamed me for it in the morning. I would have told you about Sunday mornings, her feet cold against my leg, the radio on low, coffee going stale because we were too busy talking to drink it. I would have told you we were fine. That is the part nobody warns you about. The betrayal doesn't announce itself. It doesn't kick the door in. It slides in quietly through the small cracks you stop noticing. And by the time you feel the cold air, half your house is already gone. Rachel and I met when I was 32. She laughed at everything I said, even the things that weren't funny. And there is nothing more dangerous to a lonely man than a beautiful woman who thinks he's clever. We married 18 months later. For the first 3 years, I would have walked into traffic for her. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters. I didn't marry a monster. I married a woman I adored. And that is exactly why I never saw the knife until it was already between my ribs. Now let me tell you the one thing that this whole story turns on. The one thing Rachel forgot. The one thing her expensive lawyer never bothered to check. The apartment was mine. Not ours. Mine. I bought it 4 years before I ever met Rachel. I signed that mortgage alone when I was 28, working 2 jobs, delivering packages before dawn and waiting tables at night, eating instant noodles for dinner, so I could scrape together the down payment. I remember the day I got the keys. I sat on the bare floor of the empty living room and I cried, because I'd never owned anything in my life, and now I owned 4 walls and a window that caught the morning light. And there was more to it than money, so much more. My mother spent the last 3 years of her life in that apartment. After my father passed, she couldn't stand the old house, too many ghosts, too many empty chairs at the table, so she moved into my second bedroom, and every single evening, without fail, we drank tea on that little balcony and watched the city turn orange and then blue, and then dark. She'd tell me stories about my father. I'd pretend I hadn't heard them 100 times. She got sick in the winter, she got worse in the spring, and she died, in the summer, in the room I later turned into an office, with the window open because she wanted to hear the street one last time. So when I tell you those walls were mine, I don't just mean legally. I mean in a way that went down into the foundation of who I was. That apartment wasn't property. It was the last place my mother breathed. Rachel knew all of that. She knew every bit of it. She'd sat on that balcony with me. She'd held my hand at the funeral. Which is exactly why. What she did cut so much deeper than money ever could. Because to take that apartment she first had to look at everything it meant to me and decide that none of it mattered. The first crack, looking back, was Marcus. Marcus Vale. That was the name he used, anyway. He showed up about a year into our marriage, introduced as a friend of a friend, some kind of financial consultant who helped people, and I'm quoting him here, protect and structure their assets. He had a good smile. That's the thing about men like Marcus. The smile is the whole business. He wore watches that cost more than cars, and he had this way of touching your shoulder when he laughed, like you were the most interesting man he'd ever met. The first time we had dinner with him, I actually liked him. That's what haunts me a little, even now. I sat across from the man who would try to destroy my life, and I thought, what a charming guy, we should have him over more often. Rachel started mentioning him more and more. Marcus said this. Marcus thinks we should. Marcus knows a guy who can help. At first I thought nothing of it. She'd suddenly gotten interested in money, in investments, in what she called our future, and I was happy about it, honestly, because for years she'd left all that to me, and now she wanted to be involved. What kind of husband complains about that? So I didn't complain. That was my first mistake, if you can even call it a mistake to trust the woman you married. Marcus started coming around when I wasn't home. I'd find a second wine glass in the sink, still faintly pink at the bottom, and Rachel would say, "Oh, Marcus dropped by with some paperwork," and I'd nod, because why wouldn't I nod? He even started reaching out to me directly. He invited me for a drink one evening, just the two of us, man to man, and I went, because I had no reason not to. He asked me about the apartment, casually, so casually. How long had I owned it? Was it fully paid off? Was it in my name alone? I answered every question. I actually thanked him for taking an interest. I sat there and handed a con man the blueprint to my life, and picked up the check. When I think about that night now, I feel sick. But I also understand something I didn't then. He wasn't just gathering information, he was measuring me. Sizing up, whether I was the kind of man who'd notice, the kind who'd fight, or the kind who'd sign whatever was put in front of him and thank you for the pen. He decided I was the second kind. That mistake is going to follow him for the rest of his life. Then came the papers. It started small, the way these things always do. Rachel came home one evening with a folder and this bright, careful energy, the kind of energy people have when they've rehearsed something in the car on the way home. She sat me down at the kitchen table, poured us both a glass of wine, and told me Marcus had explained how vulnerable we were. If anything ever happened to me, an accident, a lawsuit, a bad debt, the apartment could be taken, and she could be left with nothing, out on the street, a widow with no home. She said it with tears, actually starting in her eyes, and I remember thinking, God, she really loves me. She's terrified of losing me. She said the smart thing, the thing all the wealthy, sophisticated couples did, was to restructure the ownership so it was protected. Put it in a trust, add her name, make it airtight, untouchable. And I almost said yes. I want you to sit with that for a second. I almost signed my mother's balcony away at my own kitchen table because my wife cried and used the word protection. The pen was practically in my hand. The only reason I didn't is something so small it's almost embarrassing. My mother. On that balcony, near the very end, when the medication made her honest in a way she never was healthy, she took my hand one evening and said, "This apartment is your safe place. Promise me you'll never let anyone talk you out of it. Not even someone you love. Especially not someone you love." I thought she was rambling. I laughed and told her nobody was ever taking her tea balcony, that she'd have to fight me for it. But those words came back to me at that kitchen table, clear as a bell, in her exact voice, and I heard myself say, "Let me think about it." Rachel's face did something in that moment. Just a flicker. A tiny drop of the mask, there and gone in half a second. Not sadness, not disappointment, something colder, something that calculated, and then the warmth flooded back. Of course, no rush. Whenever you're ready, sweetheart. But I saw it. That flicker was the first true thing I'd seen from her in months, and I couldn't unsee it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there next to her, listening to her breathe, watching the ceiling, and I felt like a paranoid idiot. Who suspects his own wife of a crime just because she wanted to protect their home? What kind of bitter, broken man does that? So I did what most people do when their gut is screaming and their heart is begging them to ignore it. I compromised with myself. I decided I wouldn't sign anything, but I also wouldn't accuse anybody of anything. I'd just watch, quietly. And that quiet watching is the only reason I still have a home today. About 2 weeks later I noticed the mail. We had one of those little trays by the front door, and I'd started, almost without deciding to, glancing at everything that came in. A letter arrived from a title company I didn't recognize. Rachel appeared out of nowhere, and intercepted it before I could pick it up, tucked it into her bag with a laugh, said it was junk, some scam, they send those to everybody. Junk doesn't come in a stamped envelope from a title office with your home address printed on it. That was the moment my stomach truly went cold. Colder than the flicker, colder than the wine glass in the sink. I didn't say a word. I smiled. I kissed her forehead. I told her I loved her. And inside I started to build a wall around what I knew, brick by silent brick, and I decided that no matter what I found, I would not let a single crack show on my face. The next morning, after she left for what she called a spa day, I did something I'm not proud of and would do again 1,000 times over. I went into her office and I went through everything. I told myself I was just looking. I found everything. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of old magazines, there was a plain manila folder. Inside that folder was a quitclaim deed. My name on it. My signature on it. Except I never signed it. I want to be very clear about this. Because it's the hinge, the whole story swings on. That signature was mine. My loops, my slant, the way I always dragged the last letter down into a little tail, everything. And I had never in my life put pen to that document. It was dated 4 months earlier. It was notarized by a name I didn't know. And it transferred full ownership of my apartment, my mother's apartment, from me to Rachel alone, sole and separate. I had to put the folder down on the desk, because my hands were shaking too hard to hold it, because in that instant, I understood 2 things at once, and they landed like 2 separate blows. 1, my wife was stealing my home. And 2, she was doing it with a forged signature, which is not a divorce move, and it is not a marital dispute, it is a crime. A felony. And felonies, unlike heartbreak, can be proven. Now here's where most people would have exploded. Confronted her that night. Screamed. Torn the folder up, and thrown the pieces in her face, and demanded to know how she could. After everything. After my mother. After the balcony. And I understand that urge with every bone in my body. But if I had, I'd have lost everything. Because a scream is a warning. And a warning gives your enemy time to run, to shred, to disappear. to move the money and burn the evidence, and vanish into a new name in a new city. Instead, I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Nothing. I took out my phone and I photographed every single page, front and back, the deed, the fake notary stamp, the date. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, magazines and all, angled the same way, dust undisturbed. I closed the drawer. I went to the kitchen and I made myself a coffee with hands that still wouldn't stop trembling, and I carried it out to that balcony, to the chair where my mother used to sit, and I made her a promise back. I said, out loud, to the empty air, I hear you now, and I'm not going to let them take it. And then I got to work. The first thing I needed was a lawyer. But not just any lawyer, and not a divorce lawyer, not yet. A divorce lawyer thinks about splitting things fairly. I wasn't interested in fair. I needed someone who understood fraud, forgery, property law, the whole ugly machine that turns a forged piece of paper into a prison sentence. I found her through a colleague who'd once been dragged through something nasty of his own. Her name was Diane Okafor. The first time I met her, I laid the whole thing out, the flicker, the mail, the folder, the forged deed, and she listened to every word without saying a single thing, just watching me with these calm, unblinking eyes. And when I finally ran out of story, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said only one thing, and it changed everything. She said, do not change a single thing in your marriage. Do not fight. Do not accuse. Do not so much as sigh at the wrong moment, because right now, the single greatest weapon you possess is that they still believe you have no idea. So that's what I became. God help me. I drove home from her office and I walked in the door and I was warm. I was affectionate. I asked Rachel how her spa day was, whether the massage helped her shoulder. I complimented the dinner she hadn't cooked. And every night after that, for months, I lay next to a woman who had forged my dead mother's son's name to steal the place that mother died, and I told her I loved her, and I smiled at her in the dark. And I meant not one word of it. It was the hardest and most disgusting acting of my entire life. Some nights I'd lie there listening to her sleep so peacefully, so untroubled, and I'd think, how do you sleep? How does a person do this and sleep? But while I performed the loving, oblivious husband by day and lay awake by night, Diane and I built, piece by piece, quietly. First, we pulled the notary's records, and we confirmed what I'd already suspected. The notary listed on the forged deed had no active commission stamp registered on that date. The entire notarization was fake, a stolen number slapped onto a fake seal. Then we brought in a forensic document examiner, a sharp, precise woman who studied my real signatures beside the forged one under magnification for an entire afternoon and confirmed it. The signature on the deed was a traced overlay. Not my hand. Not even close, once you knew where to look. That alone was enough to kill the transfer stone dead. But Diane wanted more. Diane sat across from me and said, a bored housewife does not know how to steal a notary commission number. She does not know how to trace a forensic grade signature overlay. Somebody taught her this. Somebody has done this before. And I want to know who. And I already knew the name. Marcus Vale. So we hired an investigator, a quiet, heavy-set older man named Fitch who used to work insurance fraud and had the patience of a stone, and I gave him one name and one photograph. Within 3 weeks Fitch called me and said, we need to meet in person. And when a man like Fitch says meet in person instead of just telling you on the phone, your whole body knows it's bad before your ears do. We sat in the back booth of a diner off the highway, and he slid a folder across the table, and I felt this awful, dizzying wave of déjà vu, another folder, another stack of paper that was about to reorder my entire understanding of my own life. Marcus Vale was not a financial consultant. Marcus Vale was not even entirely Marcus Vale. Over the previous 9 years he had used at least 3 different names, in at least 3 different states, and under every single one of them he had run the exact same play. He would find a married woman. Usually one who was lonely inside a marriage that looked fine from the outside. Usually one whose husband owned something valuable and owned it outright, free and clear. He would seduce her slowly, patiently, making her feel seen for the first time in years. He would become her secret, her escape, her big beautiful reason to believe her real life hadn't happened yet. And then, gently, lovingly, he would begin to work on the asset. He would convince her that the smart, sophisticated, grown-up thing to do was to get that valuable property into her sole name, to protect it, to prepare for the wonderful new life the two of them were finally going to build together. Fitch had found 2 women before Rachel. 2. The first was named Carol. Carol had transferred a beach house into her own name, divorced her husband, and then, 6 weeks after the divorce was final, Marcus simply vanished. And it emerged that months earlier, buried in a stack of papers he'd had her sign, Carol had unknowingly signed the beach house over to a shell company that Marcus controlled. She lost the house. She lost the marriage. She lost every friend who'd taken her husband's side. She lost everything, and she never even got to keep the man she'd burned it all down for. The second woman was named Elena. And Elena, Fitch said, tapping the folder, is still angry enough, even now, to talk. I need you to understand what this meant, because it turned the entire story I thought I was living in completely inside out. Rachel believed she was stealing my apartment to build a future with the man she loved. Rachel had absolutely no idea that she was the mark. That the very second the apartment was safely in her name, Marcus would move it into one of his shells, exactly the way he'd done to Carol, and then Rachel would find herself standing precisely where Carol had stood, precisely where Elena had stood, alone in the smoking ruins of a marriage she had personally blown up. For a man who was, right now, according to Fitch's surveillance, already seeing another woman across town, a woman whose husband owned a chain of restaurants. I sat in that diner booth and I felt something I truly did not expect. For one strange, unbidden moment, I felt sorry for my wife. She was betraying me, robbing me, forging my name over my mother's memory, and she was, without the faintest idea, walking straight off the exact same cliff she was cheerfully pushing me toward. Then I remembered the balcony, and the promise, and the flicker of that cold thing under her mask, and the pity burned off like morning fog. She'd chosen this. Every step of it. She'd chosen him over the man who'd held her at his own mother's funeral. I called Diane from the diner parking lot. I said, I know why she's doing it now. And it changes nothing. And here is everything Fitch found. Diane went very quiet for a long time, and then she said the sentence I will carry with me until I die. She said, this isn't a divorce case anymore. This is a case we can win so completely and so publicly that they will wish they had never so much as looked at you. But to do it, you have to do the single hardest thing of all. You have to let them think it's working, all the way to the very end. And I understood exactly what she meant, even though every cell in my body recoiled from it. If I stopped the transfer now, if I marched into a courthouse waving my photographs and my forensics, I'd protect my apartment, yes. But Marcus would slip away clean, onto the next lonely woman, the next trusting husband, the next dying mother's balcony. Rachel might face a slap on the wrist, and a good story to tell her friends. And worst of all, they would both know that I knew, and men like Marcus, the moment they know, they get careful, and careful men are never, ever caught. But if I waited, if I let Rachel file for divorce believing to her bones that she held a legitimate, ironclad deed, if I let Marcus believe the machine he'd built was running perfectly, quietly, invisibly, then one day they would walk into a courtroom carrying the very evidence that would bury them both, and they would hand it, with their own hands, to a judge. So I waited. And I want you to understand, those months were a special and private kind of hell. Rachel filed for divorce about 5 weeks later. She did it with tears, of course, sitting me down at that same kitchen table, telling me she'd changed, we'd grown apart, she needed to find herself, she was so sorry but she just wasn't happy anymore. She had clearly rehearsed every line, and I watched her deliver the performance, and I nodded along like a gutted, heartbroken fool, and I said all the things a gutted, heartbroken fool says. I even asked her, gently, if there was someone else. She looked me dead in the eyes, took my hand across the table, and said, no, there's no one. I would never do that to you, this is just about us. And I said okay. I said okay to her face while I had. Sitting in a drawer at Diane's office, time-stamped photographs of Marcus Vale leaving our apartment on 3 separate afternoons. Afternoons I'd supposedly been at work but had actually spent in the passenger seat of Fitch's car across the street, watching my own front door open for another man. Here is the part that still, to this day, amazes me. When the full divorce petition arrived, Rachel's filing claimed the apartment as her sole and separate property, and attached to it, as her proof, entered formally into the court record by her own expensive lawyer, was the forged quitclaim deed. She put it right there. Signed, dated, notarized, fake from the top of the page to the bottom, filed with the court under penalty of perjury. Diane called me the day she saw it, and she was so calm it was almost frightening. She said, they have just entered the murder weapon into evidence for us, on the record, and now we do the hardest thing, we say absolutely nothing. We let it sit there gathering weight, and we wait for the hearing. In the weeks leading up to court, Rachel got bolder, and meaner, and, worst of all, happier. She stopped hiding it. She started leaving in the evenings, telling me she'd be at a friend's, coming home late, smelling like a cologne I didn't own. And then one night she said the thing that finally killed the last living thread of whatever I'd once felt for her. She stood in the doorway of my office, the room where my mother died, and she told me, casually, like she was mentioning the weather, that I should start looking for a new place, because the apartment was hers now, it always had basically been hers, and if I was smart I'd just be a gentleman about it and go quietly. She said it standing in that room, and I looked at her, standing where my mother took her last breath, telling me to pack my things, and I felt the very last of it go silent inside me, and I smiled, and I said, of course, you're right. I'll start looking. I'll be a gentleman. That word. Gentleman. That's the closest I ever came to warning her. And she didn't hear it at all. The night before the hearing I barely slept, but not from nerves. from a strange, heavy, settled calm. The kind you feel when you've been carrying something enormous for a long way and you can finally see the place where you get to put it down. I sat on the balcony one last time in the dark, and I told my mother we were almost there, that the balcony was still ours, that I'd kept my promise. In the morning I put on the one good suit I owned, the same one I'd worn to her funeral, because it felt right, because she should be there in some way, and I drove myself to the courthouse. Rachel arrived in a car I didn't recognize, expensive, new, and I later learned that Marcus himself was there too, sitting in the back of the gallery, unable to resist watching his own handiwork pay off. Because men like him never can resist watching. Rachel walked into that courtroom like she already owned the building, which in her mind she now owned mine too, and when she saw me sitting there, alone at the table with only Diane beside me, no army of lawyers, no fight left in me as far as she could tell, she smirked. That's the smirk. That's the one from the very beginning of all this. That little pull at the corner of her mouth that said, "You poor, slow, stupid, oblivious man." You never once saw it coming. And she was almost completely right. She just had the direction backwards. The hearing began, and Rachel's lawyer stood up first, smooth and rehearsed and expensive, and laid out their case with total confidence. The apartment was Rachel's sole and separate property. Here was the deed, signed by me, of my own free will, transferring it to her, properly and legally notarized, all of it above board and airtight. He actually held the document up for the room to see. He walked a copy to the bench and handed it to the judge. He entered it, formally, on the record, as the central pillar of their entire case. And across the room, Rachel folded her hands in her lap and leaned back in her chair, and I swear to you she was already gone, already living in my mother's rooms, already picturing me carrying cardboard boxes down the stairwell, while she watched from the window. Then it was Diane's turn. She stood up slowly. Diane has this way of standing up slowly that makes an entire room go quiet and still, like the air pressure changed. And she said, "Your Honor, we do not dispute that this deed has been entered into evidence. In fact, we agree completely that it is central, and we would like to build our entire case around it." Rachel's lawyer's brow creased. He glanced at his client. Rachel's smirk didn't move, not yet. And then Diane called our first witness, the forensic document examiner. She took the stand, calm and clinical, and she walked the court through it. Image by magnified image projected on the screen, the traced overlay, the unnatural pen pressure, the tiny hesitation marks a real hand never makes, the microscopic, undeniable evidence that the signature on that deed had never been produced by a living human being writing his own name in the ordinary flow of movement, but by someone slowly, carefully copying, tracing, forging it. She stated, under oath, in her professional expert opinion, without hedging, that the signature was a forgery. And I watched Rachel's smirk falter for the very first time. Just a hairline crack across it, a first thin thread of doubt. Then Diane called the notary. The real one, the actual man whose name and commission number had been stolen and stamped onto the fake deed. He testified that he had never in his life met me, had never met Rachel, had never notarized that document or any document remotely like it, and that on the exact date printed on that deed he had been, verifiably, 400 miles out of the state, at his daughter's wedding, with photographs to prove it. He testified that his commission number had been stolen and fraudulently used once before, that he had reported it to the authorities, and that this was the second time it had surfaced attached to a forged property transfer. The hairline crack in Rachel's face split open into something wider. Her lawyer was on his feet now, objecting, flustered, asking for a recess, and the judge was leaning forward with his elbows on the bench, and the entire temperature of that room had changed, and everyone in it could feel it change. But Diane wasn't finished. Diane was only just getting started. She said, "Your Honor, we could stop right here. The deed is a proven forgery. The notarization is proven fraudulent, and that alone voids the transfer and returns the property to my client, where it has belonged all along. But this court deserves to understand that what happened here is not one desperate woman acting alone in the dark. It is a pattern. It is a machine, and it has victims." And she called Elena. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman that Rachel had never once seen in her life walked in and started down the aisle. And I watched my wife turn around in her chair to look, and I watched her face do something I will remember with perfect clarity for the rest of my days. Because Rachel had no idea who this woman was, but somewhere in the back of that gallery, one person knew exactly who she was, and his name was Marcus. Elena took the stand, and in a steady, quiet, iron-hard voice, she told the court everything. How a charming financial consultant with a beautiful smile had drifted into her life at exactly the moment she was loneliest. How he had made her feel like the most interesting woman in the world. How he had convinced her, out of love, out of wanting to protect their future, to move her family home into her sole name. How the papers had appeared, always more papers, and always the same soothing, sophisticated talk about trusts and asset protection and being smart. How, once every last page was signed, he had simply evaporated, and how the house she thought she'd protected had ended up owned outright by a company she had never heard of. A company that records later proved was controlled entirely by him. She named him. She described him in detail, the smile, the watches, the hand on the shoulder. And then she lifted her arm and she pointed toward the back of the gallery. And every single head in that courtroom turned to follow her finger, and the chair where Marcus Vale had been sitting was empty. Because somewhere during the notary's testimony, the man who had designed and built every piece of this, the architect of the whole beautiful machine, had quietly risen from his seat and slipped out the back doors, leaving my wife alone at that table with a forged deed, a detonated marriage, and a room full of people who now understood in exact, documented detail precisely what she had done. Diane entered Fitch's complete report into evidence. The 3 names Marcus had used: Carroll's Beach House, the shell companies, the bank records tracing the stolen notary commissions back to accounts he controlled. And then she laid down the final piece, the one that even I had found difficult to look at when Fitch first showed me. Marcus had already, 2 weeks before this very hearing, put down a deposit on a condominium across the city, held jointly in his name and the name of another married woman, a woman whose husband owned a chain of restaurants. I watched Rachel read that document. I watched it land. I watched her understand, in real time, in front of everyone, that the apartment she had forged and schemed and lied and destroyed our marriage to steal was never, ever, going to be hers. That the man she had burned her entire life down for had been, this whole time, preparing to burn her too. That she wasn't the mastermind, wasn't the clever one, wasn't the winner. She was just the 3rd name on a list. The newest fool. Days, maybe weeks, away from being Carol, away from being Elena, alone in the wreckage while Marcus poured champagne for somebody new. The smirk was long, long gone. What sat on her face now was the expression of a person watching 2 entire lives collapse at the exact same moment. The marriage she had thrown away with both hands and the fantasy she had thrown it away for, both of them turning to ash in the same terrible 10 minutes, right there in front of a judge. The judge did not take long at all. He voided the transfer completely and immediately. The apartment was, and had always been, mine, my sole and separate property, purchased years before I ever met her, forged out of my hands and now placed firmly, finally, back into them. But he didn't stop there. He referred the entire matter, the forged deed, the fraudulent notarization, the documented pattern of interstate fraud, directly to the district attorney's office. And he looked at Rachel over the top of his glasses, in that flat, final courtroom voice, and told her that she would be well advised to retain criminal counsel of her own. And soon. And I sat there, at that table, my hands still folded exactly as they had been all morning, and I waited to feel triumphant. I really did. I thought that moment would feel like standing on a mountaintop. Instead, I just felt tired. And clean. Like I'd finally, after carrying something crushingly heavy for a very long way, we'd been allowed to set it gently down on the ground and walk away with straight shoulders. Marcus was arrested a little under a month later, in another state, trying to run the exact same play on the restaurant owner's wife. And the file that Fitch and I had painstakingly built became a foundation stone of a case that, the last I heard, involved 5 women across 4 years and a list of charges I can barely pronounce. Rachel took a plea. She lost the divorce settlement she'd dreamed of. She lost the apartment she'd never actually owned for a single day. She lost her name in every circle that had ever known her, the friends who'd taken her side melting away the moment the word forgery started circulating. And she avoided prison only by agreeing to testify against the very man she'd betrayed me for. The last time I ever saw her was in a courthouse hallway, months after all of it, and she stopped when she saw me, and for one strange second I actually thought she might say she was sorry. She didn't. She just looked at me and said, quietly, "You knew, didn't you? The whole time, you knew everything." And I said yes. And she said, "Then why didn't you stop it? Why did you let me walk right into it?" And I thought about the balcony, and the tea going cold, and my mother's hand in mine, and the promise I made to the empty air. And I said, "Because you were never going to believe me. You were only ever going to believe him, so I let him show you who he really was." And I turned around and I walked out of that hallway and out of that building and into the rest of my life. I still live in that apartment. I still have my tea on the balcony in the evenings, in the exact chair where my mother used to sit, and sometimes I talk to her a little, tell her the day was fine, tell her the balcony's still ours, that I kept it safe just like she asked. People who know the story sometimes ask me if I'm bitter. And the honest answer, the true one, is no. Bitterness is for people who lost. I didn't lose. And I want to leave you with the one thing this whole ordeal taught me. Because I think somebody out there listening right now needs to hear it more than they know. When someone betrays you, every instinct you have screams at you to react, to confront, to shout, to make them look you in the eye and see the damage they've done. But the loudest thing you can do is almost always the weakest thing you can do, because noise is a warning, and a warning hands your enemy the time they need to escape while they're still holding every card. The strongest move, And the hardest one by 1,000 miles is to go quiet. Stay steady, keep your face still, and let the people who are lying to you build their entire glittering world on top of that lie, brick by brick, higher and higher and higher, until the day comes when they walk proudly into a room and hand you, with their own 2 hands, the single thing that brings the whole tower crashing down on their heads. Rachel smirked at me across that courtroom because she was certain she had already won. She had the deed in her hand, her expensive lawyer at her side, my mother's home practically in her pocket. She had, as far as she could see, absolutely everything. She just never once, not for a single second, considered that I was the one who had handed her the pen.